Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Bob, and in this video I will be wearing my funky glasses and I'm going to talk about prototyping your games and how board games can help you a little with that. I hope you like the craft. Let's cue the intro. So the goal of making prototypes for your games is to answer particular design questions. It's about making a small, simple implementation of your game so that you can test it and figure out if it will actually work. For instance, for my game Brukel, I wanted to know how I would put the narrative of the game together in a way that would make sense to the player and hopefully lead to specific emotional outcomes. To figure all of that out, I built this text-based prototype of a part of the game in Twine, which is an interactive storytelling tool that lets you quickly make interactive games like this. By doing that, I was able to test the game well before development started or before we even wrote any code and figure out if the narrative did what it was supposed to do. It might look like a simple example, but it has two major takeaways. First, I mentioned that I did not start with making the full game in Twine. That might have been something you missed, but it's essential. Prototypes are rarely the full game. You only need to implement enough to answer your questions so you can move on with your design. Second, you don't really need anything fancy. The segment you just saw actually ended up looking like this, and that's obviously a lot more refined and polished than that Twine prototype you saw earlier. So that's what prototyping can really do for you. You can figure out design questions by testing things out with a quick prototype well before you are writing any code. Wait a minute, isn't Twine coding? That's digital, right? Well, yeah, that example uses a digital prototype, but you don't always need a digital one. In fact, my favorite way to prototype is through so-called paper prototypes, and that's where things really get interesting. To some of my students, this might seem counterintuitive though. After all, how are you going to do a prototype of a first-person shooter or any Twitch action game without any coding? Well, game designer Stone LeBrandy opened up my eyes to this method by asking a simple question during the game design workshop that is held annually at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. What do you have left if you take a game and you remove the controls, you remove the audio, and you remove the graphics? The answer, your gameplay, your core game mechanics, because your gameplay doesn't need the audio, graphics, or controls, so you don't need them to prototype your mechanics. For one, you could embody your mechanics in a lot of cases. For instance, you could organize a paintball game to try out some novel first-person shooter mechanics in real life. Or you could make a Kraken battling boss battle with pool noodles to prototype your role-playing boss. Or maybe you could get on a skateboard and pull some crazy shenanigans with a fire extinguisher for a skateboarding-like movement mechanic. Okay, that might work to figure some questions out, but what if you're not the physical type? Let's go back to that skateboarding game. How would you prototype something like that if you can't skate yourself? It would probably go a little bit like this.
Are you gonna go? Alright, hold on. That guy's in my way. Damn, there's just too much wind right now. Alright, right here. Wait, I gotta tie my shoe. Alright, you know what? YOLO. No more being a weenie. Right here. Skate or die. Right here. I'm just gonna come back tomorrow.
Now, thankfully, there are other ways to prototype. You could paper prototype. And at GDC, the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, this is an exercise that they have ran across many years. And I've seen many people make prototypes for all kinds of games just using pen and paper. For instance, they made a prototype for Tony Hawk Pro Skater with just some index cards and some dice. The dice mimic player skill, which can be modeled by a chance. That's something I'll discuss in another video. And the cards can be used to keep track of points, instill a fantasy, allow for combos, and so much more. There are so many board games and role-playing systems out there that simulate action extremely well. And the best part is that doing this often transfers over to your digital game. For instance, in the Tony Hawk Pro Skater example, the designers can answer questions about the points certain tricks should be worth or which fantasies are more appealing to players and so on. You can really take this to extreme lengths even. For example, I'm going to show you some early prototypes Stone LeBrandy made for a game that ended up being the AAA game Spore by Maxis. These are an early game board and characters. Here is a spreadsheet with abilities, a quick customizable character, a fancier laser cut one, an early playable prototype of the first stage of Spore, and a battle board with a rock, paper, scissors mechanic. And eventually, all of that becomes the game you now see on screen. Isn't that neat? Well, it gets even crazier. This game here is called Mechs and Minions. It's a successful board game that apparently started as a prototype for League of Legends. It's an incredibly polished, high production game that doesn't have that much in common with League of Legends anymore, but it's a ton of fun, and yeah, sometimes prototypes become games of their own. Okay, I hope this gets you excited about paper prototyping. It's quick, it helps you to answer questions about your design, and it can even spin off into its own game sometimes. It is absolutely wonderful, but it also requires skill. So here are my 7 tips towards great paper prototypes, and I will put them on an easy to overview slide. First, always try to answer specific questions. And second, do not try to prototype the entire game. So great, we have a head start as I've already discussed all of this. Let's continue. Forget quality and don't get attached. Well, that's actually somewhat of a new one. Paper prototypes are like paper cups. Like a cup becomes useless once you drink the beverage, paper prototypes are useless once they've answered your questions. So you can discard them at that point, and you certainly don't want to spend too much time making them fancier than they have to be. Next, avoid everything computers excel at. You want to keep things simple. If you need a spreadsheet to play your game, you probably want to think about simplifying it. And Stone LeBrandy actually mentioned how reducing the complexity of World of Warcraft in a paper prototype by creating aggregated values for every in-game stat allowed him to figure out balancing issues well before the playtesting team could. So don't make things too complicated. And oftentimes, having a game board is one of those overcomplicated things. Let me illustrate that a little bit. This game here is Asteroids. I hope it's familiar. It's an old Atari game. Now, pause the video here and think about what a paper prototype for this would look like. How would you capture the core gameplay, the essence of the game here? Do it now. I'll hold. Okay, so does it look a little bit like this? Well, if that was what you were thinking, you might want to imagine trying to play that prototype. Pause the game again if you have to and see what you can come up with. It's pretty dull, right? Between player turns, it would take forever to move all those asteroids around, and a computer does that really well, but it takes forever for your human to do that. So how do you fix that? Well, here is a prototype that does not use a board. A player doesn't really care about the asteroids that are that far away, so you don't have to visualize that by using a board. It only matters how close they are relatively to the player. So this system here uses a relative positioning system, and it is far easier to update. Now, if you play a lot of board games, you might notice some similarities between that last prototype and some games. So board and tabletop games are incredibly creative in terms of game design, and as a video game designer, you want to start paying attention. There is so much you can learn from them that will make you a better video game designer. In particular, you really want to get up close and comfortable with The Geek, or rather, BoardGameGeek.com. This website is an encyclopedia of all board games ever made. It has a ton of resources that you want to explore. For example, check out their list of game mechanics you're seeing now. Do you know what a worker placement mechanic is? Well, you can click on it and figure it out on BoardGameGeek, or what a roll and ride mechanic is, or what a variable face order mechanic is. These are all common board game mechanics that you can use for paper prototyping. Some of them actually carry over to successful video games design that you already know, and The Geek has all of them written up and provides a list of all the games that have been using them over the history of board games. And that's just the tip of an iceberg. Every game has its own forum, as you can see for Twilight Imperium right now, with tons of information that's relevant to you as a designer, from strategies to reviews to variants and so on and so on. So with that in mind, I recommend that you start getting into board games and look up some of the best review sites out there, such as Shut Up and Sit Down, No Pun Included, and Will Wheaton's Tabletop. And if you want to learn more about the mechanics that make these games so great, I strongly recommend the work of my colleague and fellow professor Chris Barney about his game design's pattern language. I'll let him introduce himself and his work, but you can find the full workshop video that I'm going to show you in the description.
I'm Christopher Barney. I'm a game design professor from Northeastern University. I've been an industry game design professional for well over a decade. Before that, I got my undergraduate and master's degrees in game design before there were degrees in game design. This is about game design patterns. I guess another thing I could have said about myself is that I've published a book on game design patterns that grew out of the things that I've done teaching games and learning how to teach architecture and level design, which led me to design patterns of architecture. I adapted that work to game design, building on the work of other scholars, Bjork and Helapainen being sort of the foremost, to be able to sort of bring the difficult process of deriving game design patterns from played game experience, bringing that to a level that students can participate in that process and use creating patterns as a way to understand game design themselves.
Yeah, game design patterns are another powerful skill to learn, and my colleague has you covered there. If you're watching this as a student of mine, make sure to check out his class. And if you're a game developer outside of my university, make sure to take one of Chris's workshops. And that brings me to the end of this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned how to prototype better, and that you can see the value in all of this. If anything, even the worst prototypes can still answer a lot of questions for you. For example, if it takes you forever to make your prototype because your gameplay is too convoluted, you just learned a thing or two about the scope of your game. Prototypes are an excellent tool to avoid overscoping games, so don't take this technique lightly and embed it in your workflow. Look, I prototyped Reggie. Oh, well, I guess it's not really the same, right? I mean, it does answer the most important question, though. Is he a good boy? Yeah, he certainly is. So I guess that my prototype did what it had to do. And don't worry, like the Avengers, the real Reggie will return the next video. Well, I might not have the Avengers with me, but Reggie will be there. Anyways, I'll see you then. Bye-bye.